December 2003, Fairbanks, Alaska. A city where winter darkness swallows the day and temperatures plunge to 40 below zero, where the kind of cold that kills doesn't just threaten, it promises. This is a place where survival isn't guaranteed, where one wrong turn in the wilderness means you're never coming back. And on a bitter winter night, in a small cabin buried deep in the woods outside Fairbanks, that darkness found its way inside. John Hartman was a quiet man, a 50-year-old mechanic who'd lived in Alaska for nearly 3 decades, the kind of guy who kept to himself, fixed engines for a living, and spent his evenings carving intricate wooden sculptures by lamplight. His cabin sat 15 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by snow machine or dog sled in winter, and that's exactly how he liked it. No neighbors close enough to hear a gunshot. No streetlights to chase away the stars. Just him, the wilderness, and the occasional howl of wolves in the distance. But on the night of December 18, 2003, someone else was out there in that frozen darkness. Someone who'd been watching John's cabin for weeks, learning his routines, waiting for the perfect moment. That someone was Michael Silka, a 28-year-old drifter with a criminal record that stretched back to his teenage years, a man who'd bounced from town to town across Alaska, leaving a trail of petty thefts, bar fights, and restraining orders in his wake. Michael had arrived in Fairbanks 3 months earlier, claiming he was looking for work on the North Slope oil fields, but the truth was, he was running from warrants in Anchorage and needed a place to disappear. He'd heard about John Hartman from a guy at a bar, heard that the old mechanic kept cash in his cabin because he didn't trust banks, heard that he lived alone and rarely came into town. To Michael, John sounded like an easy target, a man who wouldn't be missed for weeks, maybe months, in the vast and unforgiving Alaskan interior. Michael had been planning this for weeks, stealing supplies from a sporting goods store, a 12-gauge shotgun, ammunition, a hunting knife, cold weather gear, everything he'd need not just for the crime, but for what would come after. Because Michael had a plan, and it wasn't just about robbery. He was going to vanish into the wilderness, disappear so completely that no one would ever find him. He'd studied maps of the Brooks Range, the massive mountain system that stretched across northern Alaska, endless and unmapped, a place where a man could live off the land if he knew what he was doing. Michael convinced himself he was that man, that he could survive out there, that he could become a ghost. He had no idea how wrong he was, how the wilderness that seemed like salvation would become his prison, how the cold that he thought he could conquer would strip away everything, his sanity, his humanity, and eventually, his life. But first, there was John Hartman. On the night of December 18th, Michael approached John's cabin just after midnight, when the temperature had dropped to 45 below zero and the aurora borealis danced green and violet across the sky. He'd left his stolen pickup truck 5 miles back on a logging road, traveling the rest of the way on a snow machine he'd borrowed, which is to say stolen, from a cabin near Nanana. Michael had been watching John's cabin from the tree line for over an hour, watching the warm glow of lamplight through the windows, watching John move around inside, probably making tea or working on one of his carvings. Michael's hands were shaking, and he told himself it was from the cold, but deep down he knew it was something else. The weight of what he was about to do, the line he was about to cross. He'd stolen before, he'd hurt people in fights, but he'd never killed anyone, never looked another human being in the eyes, and pulled a trigger. But Michael had convinced himself this was necessary, that John was just an obstacle between him and freedom, that in a few hours this would all be over, and he'd be on his way north, disappearing into the Brooks Range, like a wolf into fog. He pulled the ski mask down over his face, checked the shotgun one more time, and started walking toward the cabin. The snow crunched under his boots, each step impossibly loud in the frozen silence. And when he reached the front door, he didn't hesitate. He kicked it in with one violent motion, the wood splintering around the lock, and stepped inside with the shotgun raised. John Hartman barely had time to turn around before Michael was on him, screaming at him to get on the floor, to show him where the money was, to not try anything stupid. John, to his credit, stayed calm, his hands raised, his voice steady as he told Michael there was no money, just a few $100s and a coffee can above the sink, that he could take whatever he wanted and leave. But Michael wasn't listening anymore, because something had shifted in him the moment he stepped into that cabin. something primal and violent that he hadn't expected, a rush of power that made him feel invincible and terrified at the same time. He forced John to his knees, tied his hands behind his back with zip ties he'd brought specifically for this purpose, started tearing the cabin apart, ripping open drawers, overturning furniture, slashing open the mattress, looking for hidden cash. He found the coffee can with maybe $300, found a small metal box with some gold coins John's father had given him, found a .22 rifle and some ammunition, but nothing close to the fortune the guy at the bar had promised. Michael felt rage building in his chest, felt cheated, felt like he'd risked everything for nothing, and when he turned back to John, still kneeling calmly on the floor, something inside Michael snapped. The official police report would later state that John Hartman was shot 3 times, once in the chest, once in the shoulder, and the fatal shot to the back of the head. But those clinical descriptions don't capture the chaos of that moment, the way Michael's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the shotgun, the way John's last words were asking Michael why, just why, and the way Michael couldn't answer because he didn't know, because in that moment he wasn't thinking at all, just reacting, just trying to silence the voice that was making him feel like a monster. When the shooting stopped and the cabin fell silent except for the ringing in Michael's ears, he stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, staring at what he'd done, at the blood spreading across the wooden floor, at John's body slunked forward like a puppet with cut strings. Michael's first instinct was to run, to get out of there as fast as possible, but then his survival instinct kicked in and he remembered the plan, remembered that he needed to cover his tracks, needed to buy himself time before anyone found the body. He spent the next hour staging the cabin to look like a robbery gone wrong, which in a way it was, wiping down surfaces he might have touched. Taking anything that might be valuable to make it look like theft was the motive. And then, in a moment of calculation that surprised even himself, he dragged John's body outside and buried it in a snowdrift behind the cabin, figuring the snow and cold would preserve the body until spring, by which time Michael would be long gone, untraceable, living a new life somewhere in the wilderness where the law couldn't reach. He loaded John's snow machine with supplies, the gold coins, the rifle, ammunition, food from the cabin, and extra fuel, and then he set fire to the cabin. Watching from a distance as the flames consumed the evidence, the orange glow reflecting off the snow like a second sunrise. By the time the cabin had burned to its foundation, Michael was already 5 miles away, heading north toward the Brooks Range, believing he was free, believing he'd gotten away with murder. He had no idea that John Hartman's brother David had plans to visit the cabin that weekend. No idea that the smoke from the fire would be visible for miles and would draw the attention of a bush pilot flying overhead. No idea that his snow machine tracks in the fresh snow would lead investigators straight to him like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Michael Silka thought he was vanishing into freedom, but he was actually walking into the most intensive manhunt in Alaskan history, one that would involve over 200 law enforcement officers, helicopters, search dogs, infrared tracking technology, and enough resources to make national news. Because when David Hartman arrived at his brother's cabin 2 days later and found nothing but a burned foundation and a body in the snow, he immediately called the Alaska State Troopers, and when the troopers arrived and processed the scene, they knew within hours this was murder, premeditated and brutal, and they were going to find whoever did it no matter how far into the wilderness he ran. The investigation moved with terrifying efficiency. The snow machine tracks leading away from the cabin were photographed and followed by helicopter, leading investigators to the stolen vehicle Michael had abandoned 5 miles out, and from there they found the snow machine he'd borrowed, which had been reported stolen from Nenana 3 days earlier. Security footage from the sporting goods store where Michael had stolen supplies showed his face clearly, and within 24 hours the Alaska State Troopers had identified Michael Silka as their primary suspect, issued warrants for his arrest, and assembled a task force to track him down. But Michael had a head start, and he was moving fast, pushing north through terrain that would kill most people. Through forests so dense the snow stayed soft and deep, through frozen rivers where one wrong step meant breaking through the ice, through mountain passes where the wind chill could freeze exposed skin in under a minute. Michael was operating on pure adrenaline and fear, barely sleeping, eating only when he had to, covering as much ground as possible before the authorities closed in. He ditched John's snow machine after 2 days when it ran out of fuel, continuing on foot with a backpack full of supplies, trudging through snow that sometimes came up to his waist, his face covered in frost, his fingers going numb inside his gloves. The Brooks Range loomed ahead of him like a promise, those vast and empty mountains where he believed he could disappear forever, but the reality of wilderness survival was already setting in. The temperature was dropping every night, sometimes hitting 50 below, and Michael's cold weather gear, stolen and inadequate, wasn't designed for this kind of extended exposure. He'd fantasized about living off the land, hunting and trapping like the old trappers he'd read about. But the reality was he had no idea how to set a proper trap, no idea which plants were safe to eat, no idea how to build a shelter that would actually keep him alive through an Alaskan winter night. By the 5th day, Michael was starting to realize he'd made a catastrophic mistake, that the wilderness wasn't going to hide him, it was going to kill him, slowly and painfully, stripping away his strength degree by degree until there was nothing left. But turning back wasn't an option, because behind him was a murder charge and a life in prison, so he kept moving forward, kept telling himself he could make it, kept pushing deeper into the mountains even as his body started to fail. Meanwhile, the manhunt was intensifying. The Alaska State Troopers had brought in tracking specialists from the FBI, experts in wilderness pursuit who'd hunted fugitives through the Montana Rockies and the Washington Cascades, and they were using every tool at their disposal. Helicopter-mounted infrared cameras that could detect body heat from thousands of feet up, search dogs trained to follow scent trails through snow and wind, even satellite imagery that could track movement patterns in real time. They established a perimeter based on how far Michael could reasonably travel on foot, factoring in terrain difficulty, weather conditions, and human endurance limits. And then they started tightening that perimeter, methodically clearing grid squares, following every track, investigating every abandoned campsite. The lead investigator, Sergeant Tom Bigich, a 25-year veteran of the Alaska State Troopers who'd grown up in the bush and knew the land as well as anyone, told reporters that finding Michael Silka was only a matter of time, that the wilderness was on their side, that no one survives long out there in winter without proper preparation, and Michael Silka was not properly prepared. Bigich was right, but what he didn't anticipate was how desperate Michael would become, how far he'd go to avoid capture, and how much blood would be spilled before this manhunt reached its conclusion. By day 8 of the manhunt, Michael Silka was no longer thinking clearly. Hypothermia was setting in, not the acute kind that kills quickly, but the insidious chronic hypothermia that creeps into your core over days and weeks, slowing your thoughts, numbing your judgment, making every decision feel like wading through mud. He'd lost track of where he was. The mountains all looked the same, endless white peaks under gunmetal gray skies, and his carefully planned route north had dissolved into aimless wandering, just trying to find shelter, trying to stay warm, trying to stay alive. He'd run out of food 3 days ago and had been surviving on melted snow and the occasional handful of frozen berries he found clinging to bushes, his stomach cramping with hunger, his body cannibalizing its own muscle for energy. The stolen rifle was useless because he hadn't seen any game, no rabbits, no ptarmigan, nothing. Like the animals had more sense than he did and had found somewhere warm to wait out the winter. Michael's fingers had gone from numb to painful to numb again, and he knew that was a bad sign, knew that meant frostbite was setting in, that he was losing tissue. But there was nothing he could do about it, except keep moving, keep generating body heat, keep believing that somehow he'd survive this. On the afternoon of December 26th, 8 days after killing John Hartman, Michael spotted a cabin through the trees, and for the first time in days he felt something like hope. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet, with smoke rising from a chimney, and through the window Michael could see the warm glow of a wood stove, and could practically feel the heat from where he stood shivering in the forest. He knew what he had to do, knew it was wrong, knew it would make everything worse, but the part of his brain that cared about right and wrong had shut down somewhere around day 5, replaced by pure survival instinct that said warmth equals life and cold equals death, and he needed that warmth, or he was going to die out here. Michael approached the cabin slowly, the rifle held in his frozen hands, and when he was close enough he could see through the window, see a man inside, maybe 60 years old, reading a book by the fire, completely unaware that death was standing outside his door. Michael kicked the door open just like he'd done at John Hartman's cabin, and the man looked up in shock, the book falling from his hands. His name was Robert Weaver, a retired school teacher who'd built this cabin as a getaway, a place to spend weekends away from Fairbanks, and he was completely alone. Michael didn't say anything, just stood there in the doorway with the rifle pointed at Robert, his face hidden behind scarves and frost, looking like some kind of frozen monster that had crawled out of the wilderness. Robert, to his credit, stayed calm, asked Michael what he wanted, said he could have whatever he needed, food, supplies, just please don't hurt him. But Michael wasn't listening because the warmth from the wood stove was hitting him like a physical force, and he stumbled inside, slamming the door behind him, his body starting to thaw, and with the thawing came pain, excruciating pain as blood flow returned to his frozen extremities. He collapsed on the floor near the stove, the rifle still in his hands but no longer pointed at Robert, just held loosely as Michael's body shook with uncontrollable shivering. Robert, showing remarkable courage, or maybe just recognizing the desperation in Michael's eyes, didn't run, didn't try to fight, just quietly moved to the kitchen area and started making food, heating up soup on the propane stove, slicing bread, boiling water for tea. He'd figured out who Michael was, of course. The manhunt had been all over the news, and Robert knew that the smart thing to do would be to run, to get out of there and let the authorities handle it, but something in him, maybe his decades of teaching troubled kids, maybe just basic human compassion, made him want to help this obviously suffering young man, even if that young man was a murderer. For the next several hours, a strange and fragile truce developed in that cabin. Michael ate the food Robert prepared, 4 bowls of soup and half a loaf of bread, his body desperate for calories. And as the warmth and food brought him back from the edge of death, he started to talk. He told Robert everything, about John Hartman, about the robbery that became murder, about his plan to disappear into the Brooks Range, about the last 8 days of hell freezing and starving in the wilderness. Robert listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, treating Michael not like a monster, but like one of his troubled students who'd made terrible choices and was now facing the consequences. Robert tried to convince Michael to turn himself in, explaining that continuing to run would only end in death, either from the cold or from the police, that there was still a chance for redemption if Michael surrendered now before anyone else got hurt. For a moment, Michael seemed to consider it and seemed to recognize the truth in Robert's words, but then something shifted in his eyes and the walls came back up. He told Robert he couldn't go to prison, couldn't spend the rest of his life in a cage, that he'd rather die out here in the wilderness than rot behind bars. Robert didn't argue, just nodded sadly and said he understood, even though he didn't. Couldn't possibly understand the kind of desperation and fear that had driven Michael to this point. As night fell and the temperature outside dropped to 55 below, Michael made a decision. He would stay in this cabin for the night, get a full night's sleep in actual warmth, resupply from Robert's stores, and then continue north in the morning. He told Robert he was going to have to tie him up, nothing personal, just needed to make sure Robert couldn't call for help until Michael had a good head start. Robert agreed without resistance, and Michael used rope he found in the cabin to bind Robert's hands and feet, not cruelly, even making sure the bindings weren't too tight, some small remaining shred of humanity preventing him from causing unnecessary pain. Michael positioned Robert near the wood stove so he'd stay warm, left him within reach of water, and promised he'd call someone once he was far enough away to give Robert's location so he wouldn't be stuck there for days. Robert believed him, or at least pretended to, and as Michael settled in by the fire, the rifle across his lap, Robert quietly started working on the ropes around his wrists. His decades of camping and outdoor experience having taught him a thing or two about knots and how to escape them. What Michael didn't know was that Robert's cabin had a radio. A shortwave emergency radio that Robert used to check in with his daughter every evening. And when Robert didn't make his scheduled 8 p.m. check-in, his daughter immediately called the Alaska State Troopers. She gave them the coordinates of her father's cabin, explaining he never missed a check-in, that something must be wrong. And within 30 minutes, a helicopter with a tactical team was in the air. Sergeant Bijich coordinated the response, recognizing immediately that they'd found Michael's Soka, that this was their chance to end the manhunt. The tactical team approached the cabin just before midnight, using night vision to navigate through the darkness, their weapons drawn, moving with practiced silence through the snow. They surrounded the cabin, cutting off any escape routes, and then Sergeant Begich, using a megaphone, called out to Michael, identified himself, told Michael he was surrounded and needed to come out with his hands up. Inside the cabin, Michael woke from a light sleep, his mind foggy, his body still exhausted, and for a moment he didn't understand what was happening. Then the reality crashed down on him. They'd found him. It was over. All of it. The escape. The plan. The fantasy of living free in the wilderness. Robert, whose hands were now free thanks to his careful work on the knots, looked at Michael with something like pity and said, "It's over, son. Time to stop running." Michael felt panic rising in his chest, felt the walls closing in, and his hands found the rifle. The standoff that followed lasted 3 hours. Michael barricaded inside the cabin with Robert as a hostage. The tactical team positioned outside in the lethal cold, Sergeant Begich trying to negotiate a peaceful surrender. Michael's demands were incoherent, rambling, sometimes saying he wanted a helicopter to take him to Canada, sometimes saying he just wanted to be left alone, sometimes falling silent for long stretches as he wrestled with the reality of his situation. Robert, showing incredible bravery, talked to Michael throughout the standoff, gently trying to convince him that taking more lives, including his own through suicide by cop, wouldn't solve anything, that there was still a chance for something resembling life, even in prison. The turning point came around 3 a.m. when Michael, exhausted and defeated, finally asked Robert what he should do. Robert looked him in the eyes and said, "You put down that rifle, you walk out that door with your hands up, and you face what you've done like a man." And Michael, drained of fight, drained of hope, drained of everything except a bone-deep weariness, did exactly that. He set the rifle down, opened the cabin door, and walked out into the sub-zero night with his hands raised, and the tactical team moved in immediately, throwing him face first into the snow, zip-tying his hands behind his back and reading him his rights. Robert walked out behind him, unharmed, and was immediately wrapped in blankets by the medics who'd been standing by. The manhunt was over. The trial of Michael Soka began 6 months later in Fairbanks Superior Court, and it was one of those cases that captured national attention, not because of the brutality of the crime, though it was brutal, but because of the wilderness angle. The idea of a man trying to escape justice by disappearing into the Alaskan frontier like something out of a Jack London novel. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Sarah Chen, presented overwhelming evidence. Forensic analysis that tied Michael to John Hartman's murder, testimony from Robert Weaver about Michael's confession in the cabin, the stolen items found in Michael's backpack when he was arrested, and most damning of all, Michael's own words recorded during the standoff when he'd admitted everything to the negotiators. The defense, led by a public defender named Marcus Wright, who'd drawn the short straw of defending an obviously guilty client, tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming that Michael's childhood trauma, his history of substance abuse, and the extreme stress and hypothermia he'd been experiencing had impaired his judgment. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the courtroom knew it, but Wright presented it with as much conviction as he could muster, knowing his job wasn't to win, but to ensure Michael received a fair trial. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, John Hartman's brother David, who testified about his brother's kind nature and didn't deserve to die like an animal, Robert Weaver, who described the standoff in vivid detail while also acknowledging that Michael had treated him with relative decency under the circumstances, Sergeant Begich, who walked the jury through the investigation and manhunt, and forensic experts who presented evidence so overwhelming that even Michael's own attorney seemed resigned to the outcome. Michael himself took the stand against his attorney's advice, and what he said surprised everyone. He didn't try to minimize what he'd done, didn't claim self-defense or accident, didn't ask for sympathy. He simply told the truth, that he'd killed John Hartman because he was desperate and stupid and thought he could get away with it, that he'd planned to disappear into the wilderness because he was too much of a coward to face the consequences, and that he deserved whatever punishment the jury decided to give him. He apologized to David Hartman, looking directly at him, saying he knew sorry would never be enough, but it was all he had to offer. He thanked Robert Weaver for treating him like a human being when he didn't deserve it. And then he told the jury that if they wanted to give him the death penalty, he wouldn't fight it, because part of him had died out there in the wilderness anyway, the part that made him worth saving. The courtroom was silent as Michael finished his testimony, and even the hardened reporters in the gallery seemed moved by the raw honesty of his words. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts, first-degree murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, and a dozen other charges that would ensure Michael Socha would never see freedom again. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Morrison, who'd presided over countless criminal cases in her 30 years on the bench, sentenced Michael to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 60 additional years on the other charges. As the bailiffs led Michael away in chains, he looked back one more time at Robert Weaver, who was sitting in the gallery, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Robert nodded, tears in his eyes, and that was the last time the two men ever saw each other. Michael Socha is currently serving his sentence at Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska, the same town where another famous Alaskan criminal, Paul Stephen-Jord, had committed his bank robbery decades earlier. Michael spends his days working in the prison library, has earned his GED and taken several college courses, and by all accounts has been a model prisoner. He's granted occasional interviews to journalists and criminology students, always emphasizing the same message, that the wilderness isn't freedom, it's indifference, that it doesn't care about your plans or your survival or your redemption. It just exists, beautiful and deadly, and if you go into it thinking you can conquer it or hide in it, you're already lost. He talks about those 8 days in the Brooks Range as the worst experience of his life, worse than prison, worse than anything, because out there he learned that humans aren't meant to be alone, that we need each other, need community and connection and the structure of society, even when that structure is prison walls. Robert Weaver, now in his late 70s, still lives in Fairbanks and still goes to his cabin on weekends, though he installed better locks and a more sophisticated radio system. He's given several talks at schools and community centers about his experience, always emphasizing forgiveness and redemption, always noting that Michael Socha, despite his terrible crimes, was still a human being worthy of compassion. When asked if he's afraid Michael might someday escape and come after him, Robert laughs and says no. That Michael learned his lesson about trying to survive in the Alaskan wilderness. And besides, Robert genuinely believes Michael has changed. That prison has given him the structure and boundaries he needed all along. David Hartman has a different perspective. He attends every parole hearing, though Michael isn't eligible for parole, just to ensure that the state doesn't forget what his brother John suffered, doesn't forget that a good man died for no reason other than one person's greed and cowardice. David has never forgiven Michael and says he never will. That forgiveness is something Michael doesn't deserve, and David won't cheapen John's memory by offering it. Both perspectives are valid, both men are entitled to their feelings, and the story doesn't have a tidy moral conclusion because real life rarely does. What we're left with is this. John Hartman is dead, murdered in his own cabin, his life cut short at 50 years old, his wooden sculptures still unfinished in a storage unit somewhere. Michael Socha is in prison, will die in prison, has accepted that reality with what seems like genuine remorse, though remorse doesn't bring back the dead. Robert Weaver is alive because he showed compassion to a desperate man and got lucky that the man had some shred of humanity left. And the Alaskan wilderness remains what it's always been, indifferent, beautiful, unforgiving, a place where people go to find themselves or lose themselves. And sometimes the line between those two outcomes is thinner than the ice on a frozen river in December. The lesson, if there is one, is this. You can't escape justice by running into the wilderness. Because the wilderness doesn't hide you, it exposes you, strips away all the lies you tell yourself, and leaves you face to face with exactly who you are. And if you don't like what you see, no amount of distance will change it. Michael Socha ran into the Brooks Range thinking he was running toward freedom, but he was actually running toward the truth that he was a killer, the truth that he couldn't survive on his own, the truth that the only thing waiting for him out there in the frozen darkness was death or capture, and in the end, capture was the mercy. This is Northern Crimes, reminding you that in Alaska, the wilderness is always watching, always waiting, and it never forgets.